I'm going to go through a relatively short history that kind of brought me to where the work is currently. And then the last maybe 20 minutes of the talk will be most of the recent work. And the last image will sort of point to where I'm moving to next. And then we'll open it up for some questions if you have them. I always find it really interesting and kind of productive to begin with this image. It was an image that preceding this image, I think I was moving through a period where my work felt like it needed a lot of reinvention and reorganization. There was a long bout with site-specific installations that were drawings on the walls that were architectural, where I was responding to space. There was some work on unstretched canvas and burlap, some discrete works on paper, print and drawing, more conventional painting approaches, where I felt like I was moving through various media to try to sort of teach myself how to make the paintings that I wanted to make. And around that time, I also left the body behind for a brief moment, moving through primarily material experimentations. And then I came back to the figure with this painting, His Life Depends on Spotted Lies, which happened at a time where I didn't have a studio. I was living in my tiny Brooklyn apartment and was working on a small 20 by 26 painting because in part that's all I could afford. And that's literally the only thing that my space could accommodate. And after moving through this moment of sort of non-representation, pouring paint, thinking about surface and viscosity and texture and edge more than culturally specific symbols, I wanted to come back to the figure because I felt like there was something at risk in not imaging the body. There was a kind of nagging sensation where part of my practice felt like it was missing something and not authoring this conversation about the body, about the kinds of images and projections and constructions that various bodies are subject to on a daily basis. And so I came back to this portrait sort of orientation, made this sort of figure in the foreground, a kind of pattern, loose reference to architecture in the background, distanced the figure with the sort of shadow behind it, and then started carving the eyes into the surface of the painting. Initially, the eyes were right in the center in the facade, sort of where you would expect them to be, but I think there was something about the intimacy of this process. I was literally carving it on my bed, so wood chips were getting all over the place, that really felt like it required that I imbue the object with a little bit more empathy. So I kept carving and continued carving eyes, somewhat recklessly, somewhat thoughtlessly, somewhat aimlessly, until I sort of landed right at the sort of base of the neck of the figure and then stopped. And it was the first moment where this idea about sort of imbuing the body with a certain kind of evidence of the gaze and a certain kind of motif for bearing witness beyond the sort of conventional or traditional eyes of the figure really sort of began to percolate for me. In the background of this image what was happening in the background was the acquittal of George Zimmerman after he had murdered Trayvon Martin with impunity by the state of Florida. And I can't say that at the time I was thinking about this deliberately. I can't say that I wanted to put it into my work. However, sort of coinciding with this tension that I was feeling in my studio practice, where I felt like I was missing something by not imaging figures, in the world, I was also witnessing the space in which bodies that looked like mine and other bodies as well were being mercilessly gunned down by state-sanctioned violence. And there was something about that kind of made me want to come back and be a part of this sort of very human process of authoring and imaging the body and painting. I include this image. It actually preceded the previous image, and this one was sort of at the tail end of this kind of tumultuous, tumbling process of working through viscous material, dry pigment, wet pigment, to sort of excavate the body from the surface. I have always kind of had a tenuous relationship with this artificial binary between abstraction and representation. It makes a lot of sense for me to think through forms and textures and symbols sort of across those two polarities. And so even when I shifted all the way to a non-representation, so to speak, the body was always present, the figurative element was always present, gravity was always present in very particular ways. And then now, even though I'm working with the figure again, I think I still try to sort of sift through ways to think about how can I still have the kind of presence and materiality that the body and the figure requires and sort of demands, but strip away the sort of conventional relationship to rational space. Because in part, that kind of unstable, playfully unstable, productively unstable, I should say, relationship to space is something that I source quite often. As Leanne mentioned in that beautiful and generous introduction, I was born in Port-au-Prince, Haiti. We moved to Miami when I was 6 years old, and I grew up in Miami and then slowly started making a trek up the East Coast, doing my education in various parts, and then now I live in Philadelphia and call Philadelphia home. But in the background of sort of my rearing and coming of age was narratives and oratory by my parents about Haiti, was historical content that certainly influences my perception and ideas about Haiti as well as myself, my own sort of experiences moving about the United States as someone who sort of adopts at least a phenotypically a relative relationship to this country's version of blackness, but also carries with me this sort of mythology and family history and social history from Port-au-Prince and from Haiti. And I really sort of think about the combination and milieu of all of those different sources of content coming together intentionally and intentionally not resolving, sitting together with their tensions most productive in play. I think Audre Lorde refers to it as a biomythography in Zami, when she talks about the confluence of biography, mythology, and history. And so all of this stuff is sort of on my mind when I'm thinking about how do I want to deal with the body, how do I want to deal with history, how do I want to deal with oratory and symbolism. And when I started carving eyes, the eyes really became a kind of way of evidencing the gaze and a way of evidencing the process of seeing, the sort of physical and material residue of the gaze and of bearing witness. So I came back to my studio and became obsessed with these eyes, which in images, those of you that haven't seen my work in person, you probably can't tell, but all of the eyes are carved right into the surface. I was in part trained as both a painter and printmaker, and I think I found a lot of productivity once I completely ignored the boundaries between painting and printmaking, so much so that currently the demarcation between painting and printmaking in my studio is sort of unproductive. I think about them as mutual strategies to get to the surface that I'm after. So I came back to the studio with this refreshed and really excited relationship to the surface, and particularly the carve. The eyes sort of carved into the body, the eyes that look back at the viewer just as intently as the viewer attempts to focus onto the bodies of the paintings. The eyes that perhaps even point to other bodies that have been subject to similar gazes. And for a while, I avoided making paintings specifically about Haiti or referencing Haiti, because as I said, I felt like my relationship to the country was still evolving. I live in the diaspora, and I was negotiating a family relationship here, as well as cousins and aunts and uncles back home, who of course didn't consider us to be Haitian because we had become naturalized Americans and we spoke English very well and we were losing our accents and all that, all the sort of evidences of inauthenticity. were beginning to sort of be leveled and weaponized against us in the ways that are very familiar to any of us who live in the diaspora. The kind of mythologizing that happens around home and wherever home is situated is very much a sort of constant reality. And in my practice, I think that mythology has to be centered not as a site of trauma, but as a site of productivity, as a site of imagining potential futures, as a space in which to rethink a relationship to rational space, a space in which to question the boundaries and ethics of the irrational, and a space in which to reimagine what the body could potentially be. And so I came back to this painting and really thought of it as a kind of dedication to Haiti. As Yili toujours connaît, as Yili refers to Mary in the Vodou pantheon, or the Loa who takes the shape of Mary in the Vodou pantheon, and there's five different characteristics of her. And I wanted to give her these sort of thick muscular legs, and across the top of the skirt of the figure, you'll see a sort of heart shape drawn in chalk. And during Vodou, you would normally draw the veve, or the symbol of that particular loa, in chalk on the ground. And so I drew that symbol across the top of her skirt in chalk, and then carved the eyes into the legs of the figure. I include this image just to kind of identify some of my studio ancestors, people who I think about quite often when I'm working. Frankenthaler, in the kind of honesty and vulgarity of her gestures. Colescott, who is certainly one of the masters in my practice, and who I don't think gets enough of recognition, particularly in terms of thinking about this kind of cross-section or intersection between the historical and the personal. Polka, Sigmar Polka, who was the first artist I was introduced to, who sort of started to blur and merge the boundaries between painting and printmaking in very specific and physical ways. And the late Belki Sayon, who Museo del Barrio did a phenomenal show of very recently, and who was one of the first artists who I experienced who took printmaking and made it site-specific. And it was something that really resounded with me quite powerfully, taking the graphic gesture and turning it into something physical. This image is one that I think really functions as a kind of checkpoint in my practice. My work looks very different from this currently, of course, but it happened at a moment where I was starting to rethink how the body is going to come back into my work. I knew the body needed to come back in. I knew I wanted to rethink how the body is recombined into very specific ways. And one of those sort of expressions of the body is certainly gender. And in order to kind of think through that, I started to think about what are the sort of essential symbols and identifying characteristics of the body that I'm trying to image. And I actually want to talk about it through one of this image, which many of you are familiar with, I'm sure. So when we moved to the States, like I said, I was 6 years old, and I think there was a kind of hurried, not necessarily anxiety, but there was certainly a kind of hurried expectation on my part to become as fully American as I could, certainly more so than my brothers, who were both older than me. And I grew up in Miami as a kind of closeted queer kid who was trying to figure out this language and this terrain and these people. And one of the shows that was really popular at the time was The Golden Girls. And for anybody who doesn't know, The Golden Girls is, one of the best shows in television history. Might be the best. If you want to debate that afterwards, let's do it. But it was one of the shows that really resonated with me. And for those who don't know, it's 4 women who are in their lives. They've raised their children. Their husbands have either passed away or they're divorced, and they're rebuilding their identities beyond their identities as mothers and as wives. And they all live in South Florida, in Miami, in the exact same neighborhood that we lived in. And so there was a lot of connection just watching the show and listening to all the references that they made. And The four of them have these very specific characteristics. I mean, expert writing. Sophia on the far left is the eldest and the mom. Rose on the far right is sort of the nitwit, lovable goof of the bunch. Blanche, who's sitting on the stool, is the sort of promiscuous one. She's also the youngest and reminds the girls of that every minute she gets. And Dorothy is she's a substitute teacher. She's the most well-read. She's the kind of stick-in-the-mud prude of the bunch, played by B. Arthur, the incomparable B. Arthur. And the girls sit around the kitchen table and regale stories of their past lives, and they all had this very specific way of beginning their stories. Sophia would always say, "Picture it, Sicily." Rose on the far right would always say, "Back in St. Olaf." Blanche on the stool would say, "Growing up in the South." And Dorothy would always say, "I remember when I was a little girl," which struck me because it seemed intentional on the writer's part, because if you know B. Arthur, even her previous character, Maud, she's tall, broad-shouldered, short hair, a raspy voice. There is nothing, well, I won't say nothing, but there seemed to be a way in which B. Arthur's physical characteristics were intentionally at odds with this really poetic reminder by the writers that even she, this woman who stands at least a foot taller than most of the other women in the show, who gets relentlessly made fun of for not having a sex life that was similar to the other girls, even she remembers a time when she was a little girl. And there was a kind of disassociation with a feminized body that was happening in her character consistently throughout the show. Even before I had a language for queerness, even before I had a language for that kind of sexualized body, I could tell that disassociation was taking place. And one of the many reasons why I loved the show and loved her character in particular. And it was very similar to her character, Maud, that she played right before the Golden Girls. And B. Arthur would always start her narratives with, "I remember when I was a little girl." Additionally, I think, so that's happening in my mind. But at the same time, like I said, I'm one of three boys, and we're all this big, so performances of masculinity were common in my mom's house. And growing up and not necessarily knowing how to identify with particular masculine traits, I often remember my brothers sort of correcting my behavior when it didn't fulfill or fit their expectations of masculinity. Acting like a little girl or crying, which meant crying or tattling or telling my parents, was a mortal sin. And so this idea of sort of going back to this moment where even I remember, behaving like a little girl was a problem, combined and coincided with this really beautiful moment I had with the show. And so when it came to titling this painting, I knew the title had to be "I Remember When I Was a Little Girl." I include this image, which is much more recent, because it's this sort of full bleed, covered in eyes, abstracted body. As I said earlier, I'm thinking so much more about how the body is constructed and reconstructed, imagined, reconfigured, both denies and responds to rational space. And for me, that includes a kind of open field and a fully expansive space in which to think through the figure. And along those same lines, I came back to portraiture. As I said in that first image, that was sort of an indirect response to what was happening with Trayvon and many other young men and women at the time who were being mercilessly gunned down. But right after Darren Wilson murdered Mike Brown, I had a very similar reaction, had a very similar sort of guttural, corporeal response to the situation, because one of the defenses that Darren Wilson used for killing Mike Brown was that Mike Brown appeared to be a demon coming at him, that his body had completely been reconfigured. And I think I have he says in his testimony, he argues that he felt like Mike Brown was a Hulk Hogan coming at him. That's just how big he felt and how small I felt. just grasping his arm. He turns, and when he looked at me, he made like a grunting, like an aggravated sound, and he turns, and he's coming back towards me. The first step is coming towards me. He kind of looks like a stutter step to start running. When he does that, his left hand goes in a fist, goes down to his side, his right one goes under his shirt and his waistband, and he starts running at me. At this point, it looked like he was almost bulking up to run through the shots, like he was making him angry that I'm shooting at him. So I include that, but I also wanted to include this testimony from the defense attorney interrogating one of the police officers who was involved in the Rodney King beating. And the defense attorney asked, "You didn't see him have a weapon, did you?" And the officer says, "Yes, I did see him have a weapon." Defense attorney says, "What kind of weapon did Mr. King have?" And he says it was his body. And so I've always been sort of compelled and really provoked by this idea that the body can be specifically and deliberately reconfigured in the imagination. And to think about it as a kind of potentiality for what the body could become if that space is exploited, right? And to not, to sort of resist the urge to cast such a harsh judgment on that space just yet, because there's potential there for imagining potential futures with the body. And for me, that's really what the kind of ever-expansive and kind of topographical motif of the eyes do. They sort of take that evidence and hold us there. A good friend describes as a kind of a circuit that's built between the bodies and the viewer, where there's a kind of perpetuity and opacity that sort of takes shape there. So I went back to my studio and continued to think through, what do I do with these bodies? What do I do with the symbolism, the ornamentation that was being borrowed from anecdotal stories of my childhood, as well as historical iconography, as well as sometimes very specific art historical references. How do these things come together? And above all, how do they come together spatially? The location of this stuff, I felt like, was really, I was at a place where I needed to kind of center it and ground it. And this painting took place when I was just thinking through the artifice of that proposition and not, or resisting an urge to resolve it. And I thought about putting it on a performative stage, putting it on a lo-fi kind of low to the ground stage wherein all of the activity and all of the energy could take place. And I drew onto the panel the stage at the bottom of this image, and immediately it sort of evidenced the kind of artificial performative space that I had been talking about. It took the light in my paintings and took the sort of gravity in my paintings and really leveraged it for the artificial space that it was. And it was the first painting that I had made with a stage in it. And all of a sudden it all made sense. I never really felt comfortable with setting the activity in my work in something as rational as like a living room or a kitchen or a bedroom or a space that was so immediately identifiable. It felt disingenuous to the content, and certainly disingenuous to what I was talking about. And so the stage really came in with this particular image. I include a couple of the prints that motivate my practice. As I said in the beginning, I work through strategies in printmaking quite a bit. Oftentimes what happens is I will make tons and tons of drawings. Those drawings then get separated into either compositions for paintings or patterns. The ones that turn into paintings I'll set aside and eventually think through what those compositions might be like. But the ones that turn into patterns get printed or drawn first onto copper, then etched, then that copper etching is turned into a screen, and then that screen is turned into a pattern, which eventually works its way onto the surface of the painting. So there's all these different steps and levels of remove that, for me, are really important because I think they again, sort of disassociate the viewer from the source of that gesture. The expressive gesture gets sort of put through various filters, some of which are analog, some of which are digital, some of which are very much process-based, so that by the time it ends up on the painting surface, it's still pretty malleable and sort of unfixed. And I really value that about this kind of fluid line between drawing and printmaking. So the stage at this point becomes a really preeminent sort of spatial condition in my work. It's an incredibly shallow space that I try to pack in quite a bit of information into, and oftentimes you'll see things like machetes and the pig symbolism pop up. You'll see the pig pop up quite a bit. In 1981, the U.S. organization Aida, which was doing work in the Dominican Republic, under anxiety and threats of swine flu that had supposedly broken out, was afraid that the disease would eventually cross over into Haiti or into the United States. And so they went in and told Haitian farmers and peasants that they had to kill their Creole pigs and replace them with the pink, fleshy American pigs that we're familiar with, without telling them that these pigs would need cement pens built, without telling them that these pigs would not take well to the harsh climate and harsh weathers in the Caribbean, without telling them that the feed had to be flown in and it was far more expensive. And so this sort of intervention under the guise of health gutted the Haitian economy for many years to come. And Haiti's history is quite full of these sort of interventions from the international community that directly and indirectly have always tried to sort of punish Haiti for achieving the task of black self-actualization in 1804 during the revolution. The revolution centers largely, especially in my new work, as a moment, as a historical moment of production and creativity and activity that I sort of come back to quite often, because certainly in, I think, the Haitian imaginary, it figures pretty largely. And so in the narrative that I try to construct, which straddles the line between myth, personal biography, and history, I feel like it's particularly necessary to sort of circumambulate the revolution as this really sort of creative and productive space. So you'll see a machete in the center, and then just beyond the kind of chain link, yellow chain link in the back, you'll see yet another machete, and then the figure, this sort of multi-legged figure carrying a fleshy pig across the stage. The pig again comes to perform on the stage. You'll notice that a lot of the titles in the paintings are also in Creole. Cochon sa condensé translates to "these pigs know how to dance." I want to talk about this painting for a little bit, which was a fun one to make. I wanted to think through the moment of the revolution as a kind of historical collapse with what was happening in France at the time, the French Revolution. And if I could take the sort of these two spaces, these two groups of people, and sort of combine them, how would I do that in a single painting or in a single image? And I landed on Jacques-Louis David's Death of Marat. And Death of Marat, David started painting this image in 1791, which was exactly around the time that the revolution began. And actually, many historians believe that Maroons were planning the revolution much longer than that. But when they actually stormed into the center of town was in 1791. And David was, Marat painted David, who was a martyr of the revolution. Historians believe that Marat had some kind of skin condition which required these oatmeal baths, maybe akin to eczema. And it's why Charlotte Corday knew he was in the bathtub in the first place, that she could approach and slaughter him. And I wanted to collapse that moment with Ma Tante Toya, who is believed to have been Jean-Jacques Dessalines' aunt. Jean-Jacques Dessalines was the second leader of the Haitian Revolution, known to be far more ruthless and far more merciless than his predecessor, Toussaint Louverture. And the woman who taught Dessalines how to be so merciless and so ruthless was his aunt, Ma Tante Toya. And she's seldom sort of given the space that I think she requires in history books. And so I thought, what if I could take this sort of quintessential image and replace Marat's very much dead body, very much sort of martyred body, with that of Toya Mantu, and sort of remove the kind of mythologized skin condition and replace it with this maybe evolutionary potential for the eyes to point to a different kind of agency, and replace the Girondan dagger, which I think in the original painting is around here, with a machete, kind of quintessential symbol of the Haitian Revolution, or Third World Revolutions broadly. And one thing that I really sort of love is in David's original painting, the wooden desk is painted, and in mine, that's actually just a raw wood surface, since I do work on wood panel. And so the eyes are carved in here. This is all drawn, and that's the raw wooden surface, and the machete is a collage. Oftentimes I'll toggle back and forth between historical narrative and personal biography, and this was a painting where I was trying to think about how could I sort of collapse the way I thought about masculinity in the men that I'm closest to in my life, my dad and my husband. My father being a man of specific, I always like to call him like he's like an anthology of Haiti. Like he was in the military, he was in Papa Doc's military, very similar to many of us who grew up in immigrant households. He never wants to talk about Haiti, never wants to talk about Port-au-Prince. They sort of often say "nous quitter ça derrière," which means we left all of that behind. But of course, that's all the stuff that I'm interested in. And so I wanted to think about what it would mean to collapse him and my husband, and really think through masculinity and these two very different people, and these two, they couldn't be more different. And I found this image of my father, I think it was in 1992, right after Hurricane Andrew, which, as if anybody is familiar with South Florida, decimated a large part of South Florida, flattened Homestead, many of the building codes and zoning codes in Florida that are enforced currently were as a result of Hurricane Andrew. And we lived in Miami at the time, and the storm knocked out, we were relatively fine, the storm knocked out power, but we were pretty much okay. I remember my dad was looking for propane and charcoal to cook, but everywhere was sold out. And then he finally got some, came back home, lit the grill, and did a little dance. And if anybody knows my father, he doesn't dance. So I found a picture of my father in a sort of bright pink shirt. The shirt top was wide open, and he was flailing about and dancing, and my mom took the picture. And I found this kind of evidence and snapshot of exuberant joy, unmitigated joy, which in my mind was a moment in which he denied that whatever conception of masculinity that he previously occupied. And it was the closest I could get him to come to this idea of a kind of queer joy that I think is one of the ways in which we talk about queerness. And so I felt like the easiest thing to do and the simplest thing to do was to double that moment and call the painting Two Dads. And so I took this image, drew it out, started carving into it. And rather than even try to image either him or my husband, the symbolism of this image just became much more productive and powerful for me. And then in the front, a kind of apparition of the pigs that I had mentioned prior sort of hovers just before them on the stage. And this is actually also one of the few paintings where I don't have the figures on the stage. I have them just behind the stage. C'est pas sirène seulement, it's not siren only. Sirène is sort of the goddess of the water. Oftentimes I think about speed a lot in painting, and trying to make sure that the paintings accelerate and decelerate at very specific times. And on a very formal level, one of the ways I think about that is through edges. And so there are a couple paintings over the last couple of years where I included no collage, no color, nothing but the gesture of the carve. And so this was one of those paintings where I wanted to think through Baron Lacroix and Baron Samedi two of the Loas who were sort of known to be warring, masculine gods, and instead of presenting them as these sort of warring factions, I wanted to think about the potentiality of presenting them as lovers conjoined at the arm, and then you filled in the background of the image with this almost like Van Gogh serpentine carve that not only merges them but also merges their edges with the space around them. I include this image mostly because it points to the current work, and this was the first one where the curtain as a kind of analogy for the body, but also the curtain as a kind of analogy for the stage, came into the work. Aida is one of the Loas who presents herself as a rainbow, but in this painting I wanted to make her a physical object, make her a physical curtain. And then also use the eyes to sort of point to the potential that the body can't actually be consumed by any specific form, and in fact the body goes beyond, well beyond the picture plane, well beyond the composition. So it sits behind the stage, it sits behind the curtain, it sits behind most of the activity. It's sort of omnipresent in a very specific way. Oh, sorry about that. Translates into Stay Under the Bed With Me, a painting made and dedicated to my husband. Pieds pas pour moi, my feet aren't mine. Oftentimes, and I think there's another painting in the slideshow that talks about this, but particularly with my mom, but I think even with many of us who come from Haiti, the history in Haiti is so tenuous, and our relationship to our ancestors in Haiti has always been so kind of conflicted that I think my mom and I often talk about this idea of sort of us borrowing strength from her and us borrowing stability and leverage from her. And I wanted to make a painting sort of dedicated to that. It's a very small image. This one's 18 by 24, which is rare. And just simply titled it, My Feet Aren't Mine. As I move into the newer work, I wanted to include this excerpt from a show that I have up currently or just came down at Southern New Hampshire State University, where in the essay, Jamisha Lackey, who's actually a film writer and film and African American studies writer, made what I thought was a beautiful connection between the way in which Frantz Fanon talks about the abstraction of black skin and abstraction in painting, which she says, for me, these paintings are reminders of the difficult interpersonal work at the heart of the post-colonial experience, a quote-unquote mission which conscripts us, as Fanon reminded, out of the relative obscurity of being born with skin. And Fanon figured and figures very largely in my work. Was first introduced to his writing, particularly Black Skin, White Mask, as an undergraduate, and have read and reread that work many times. And I think in many ways this idea about evidencing the gaze and about insisting on a kind of opacity, which began with Edouard Glissant, one of the fathers of the Créolité movement, but Fanon was also thinking about Glissant. It has continually sort of been revisited in my work in various ways, and I think even now I'm kind of scratching the surface, no pun intended, with this motif of the gaze that I think still has a ways to go. This was the first painting in my most recent show, Curtain Stages and Shadows, which was an incredibly emotional experience that I probably should have seen coming. And it was the first time where I sort of set out to try to combine all of this content that I mentioned earlier that, I would think Audre Lorde calls a biomythography into a sort of broad expanse narrative. Nupoko Ive Meyaptanu translates into we haven't arrived, but they'll wait for us. When we first when my mom was thinking about moving from Haiti, which was a decision that her and my parents made based out of political reasons, because they were both very politically involved, but also because we had family in Miami that were kind of nagging my parents and saying, "Hey, it's time to leave." we always had that kind of connection with family back home that was made possible by phone cards and messengers and containers that ship back and forth between Miami and Haiti and New York and Haiti and basically all of the large, the big cities in the United States that have a Haitian community. And so there's this way in which that kind of interconnected diasporic relationship is made physical and made evidentiary. And there's kind of anticipation about that, and I wanted to make a painting that centered the stage, that centered the performativity, that centered the artifice, but actually had no physical bodies in it, unless perhaps we think about the sort of vast expanse of the background as its own body. And this was the very first painting in the show. Même pendant ma danse translates into even while I'm dancing. Leanne, how are we doing on time?
Great.
Good. Like how you doing? When we were growing up, we would often complain and gripe about the house being too dark, because my dad had this really interesting anticipation that neighbors were watching us, and we couldn't let them know what was happening inside our house. No matter how many times I had told him, nobody gives a shit about what's going on in our house. And so we often have these fights about, the shades and the windows being drawn when it was like 2 o'clock in the afternoon and the house was pitch black. And so, like Babli translates into let the curtains down, I don't want them to see us. And the title of the exhibition I should mention was Curtains, Stages, and Shadows, which was a very intentional sort of omission of the body. I wanted to evidence the 3 material conditions that kind of let the viewer know that there is a body happening and there is a body in the space. But I wanted to allow the read and the formulation around the body to happen with the viewer. As I mentioned earlier, I think there's a kind of circuit that gets built with the paintings around the eyes and around this idea about the gaze and bearing witness. And the perpetuity of that and the opacity of that, I think, is really important. And so even in thinking about how to title the exhibition, I wanted to make allusions to every other condition of the painting except for the figure, and allow the figures to be built by the viewer's expectations, the viewer's desires, the viewer's fears, the viewer's fetishes. Loosely translates into mind your own business, with 2 figures in the painting, which I don't know if you can see the second one, but it's over here, and then this figure's pushing down on that figure. Just include like a slightly more sort of installational version of the painting. I assume some of you have seen the work in person. They read very differently in person than they do in images. I was just speaking with Leanne before you all came in about the sort of problematics of that. And I think now I'm super comfortable with it because painting is concerned with physical space, not pictorial space. And so it should sort of resist the camera at all times, and I think I'm kind of okay with that. I sort of moved through many years of working through surfaces that were matte and glossy and cut and gritty and smooth, and now my paintings are a big pain in the ass to photograph. But I think painting should be a pain in the ass to photograph. Painting should sort of produce some friction with photography. In the grand sort of narrative of the exhibition, which, as I said, spanned 2 galleries, Curtain, Stages, and Shadows, Act 1, and Curtain, Stages, and Shadows, Act 2. And it was sort of sequential. The second half of the exhibition culminated in a Madonna and Child, which I'll get to in a second. But that painting was installed with this painting, which I really thought of as like this birth. What would these figures look like in the womb? What would they look like inside the body? What would it look like if we could become sort of internal rather than external? And it made sense to return the previous language for that. In many of those first paintings, I was thinking through suspension and kind of lack of gravity and all of these different ways in which I could resist rational space. And so all of that came to play as I thought about what one of these figures would look like if they hadn't been born yet, if they hadn't been released into the world yet. Qui l'autre moins belle pour vrai translates into my panties are pretty, aren't they? Machete pas tout avec means I travel everywhere with it. I have very distinct memories of my dad wielding a machete for various different uses when we were growing up, and having now sort of landed in my mid-30s, the machete as a kind of symbol, and the machete as a almost as like an Excalibur, I think figures largely in the Caribbean diaspora. I remember when I was leaving home for college, and we were packing up my car and about to drive to Baltimore. At the very end, the trunk was full, everything was full, and my dad came out of the house sort of carrying this machete like it was made of gold or something, and put it in my trunk. And I said, why are you putting a machete in my trunk? He said, you don't know who's up there, you might need it. And I was like, I don't think I'm gonna need a machete at art school. I think I'll be okay. But I still brought it with me. It was, I felt like he said I had to bring it, so I brought it. And to this day, I still have machetes in the house. I even remember when we were kids, he, instead of using like an edger for the grass, he would like edge it with a machete. And it was straight as hell. Like it was pretty amazing. And so I definitely felt like there needed to be a painting in the exhibition dedicated to the machete. Waptombe Map Campbell, which was a meditation on the kind of enmeshed relationship that between two lovers, and especially sort of thinking through my relationship with my husband, and these two figures for whom the boundary between them, I think you really sort of have to struggle to see. It's a little bit apparent in the image, but certainly in person, the edges and boundaries between the two figures touching just at the calf of the figure on the left becomes really obscure and really diffuse. And very early when I started carving images, I realized that that was going to be, like I said, a site of sort of productive tension, and I wanted that kind of lack of discerning characteristics between the figures. I wanted them to sort of meld into one another, and the potentiality of what that could possibly mean, and how it could even sort of cause an even deeper struggle to think about them singularly. I think the eyes, along with serving as a kind of motif for bearing witness in the gaze, I think the eyes also point to this question of multiplicity that can engineer very different relationships to subjectivity and altered relationships to subjectivity. Something I think in the Caribbean and in many parts of the world that are already very much a part of daily life. I think the West is actually new to thinking about queerness and multiplicity in this way. In many other parts of the world, these have been ways of living and engaging for generations. I included this image because the paintings are really tough to see, and so you can kind of get a sense of what's happening on the surface. The stages were all sort of drawn and sanded right into the surface of the panel, and then the painted and collage elements, so really where the color comes in, and then the eyes are carved right into the surface. First, the surface of the painting is stained, and then the eyes are carved in. Kimunukele Olympia, who's called Olympia? Very simply, I wanted to make an Olympia. I wanted to think about this kind of precious but also mythologized, often prepubescent young white woman who had figured so largely in Western painting, but think through what it could mean to reimagine their body and to remove specific signifiers and codes of gender, and to imbue their body with this kind of device for bearing witness that I had developed in the previous work, and make a painting dedicated to them. This was the Madonna and Child painting I was referencing earlier, Danto Anais. And in Haiti, if you see Madonna and Child, it's not Mary and Christ, it's Ezeli Danto and her daughter Anais, who Ezeli Danto is one of Ezeli's sort of most intense characters. As I mentioned earlier, she has 5, and Danto is the meanest, but also the most loving. She's the most vicious, but she's also an incredibly tender and loving mother. And she's often presented with her daughter, Anais, and you actually have to speak to Ezeli through Anais. You can't speak to her directly. And I became really interested in the idea that in the Caribbean, this very common religious and mythologized motif of Madonna and Child actually takes a somewhat feminist bent, and Christ is sort of removed from the narrative altogether. And it made sense to sort of culminate the show with this painting. The 2 exhibitions, the one at James Fuentes Gallery was sort of a broad open space that you walked into, which made sense because a lot of those paintings were very active and large format, almost panoramas. And you sort of walked into the show at a tangent. And on his Arena Gallery, it was much more processional. And so as soon as you walked in, you could see this painting right at the end of the hall, and so you had to sort of process towards this painting through the previous paintings. And it made sense to culminate the painting on this particular image. And as I started to think through Madonna's shawl, or Ezeli's shawl, and the patterning around it, I found this image of my mom wearing a dress that was very similar. That was the same shade of blue, and it had this gold, really beautifully patterned gold collar. And so I used that, used her dress for Madonna's Ezeli's dress here. And it might be hard to tell, but there's some. These patterns here are the same heart shape that was in that first painting that I showed you guys. Tuer tout cochon yo means kill all the pigs. As I mentioned earlier, the pig and swine figures largely in my work, not only because of the historical moment of 1981, but also pig is a huge part of the diet and culinary traditions. In the Caribbean, it's used during sacrifice. It's used as currency. Ezeli loves pork, and in that previous painting, there's a figure sort of tessellated in the background where there's these patterns of pigs that have been printed in Talio and then collaged into the painting. So I come back to the pig quite a bit, and then in this image, there's a sort of silhouette of a pig right at the bottom corner that this figure is slaughtering with a machete. And it's somewhat combined with an event that took place when I was a kid, and where I watched my dad and one of our neighbors exterminate an over-infestation of possum that had taken place on our block. And I sort of witnessed the amazing efficiency of this scene. And in my mind, I think it sort of coincides with the same kind of efficiency and deliberate intervention that sort of took place in 1891 and other events like it. Téléphone ça pas jamais sonné. As I mentioned earlier, we moved to Miami in 1989, and I think I was in a bit of a rush to sort of become naturalized to this country. And I learned English very quickly, and in our house, I began speaking English. I was the first one to start speaking English. And so whenever the phone would ring, someone would invariably hand the phone to me to talk to whoever was on the other line. Mind you, I was probably like 9 or 10 or 11. And oftentimes this was immigration or debt collectors or something really serious that probably a 9-year-old shouldn't be on the phone talking to. But because I spoke English the best of all of us, I was often like the phone guy. And even to this day, I have a really not so great relationship with landlines. And so in thinking about the sort of mythologizing that happens around this work, I knew I had to make a painting sort of dedicated to the phone. So téléphone ça pas jamais sonné translates into this phone is never not ringing. And I will end on this image, which was a sort of segue from the last exhibition, and this recent show was the most sort of historically grounded show I'd ever worked on, and I think moving forward, some of that history will still kind of figure largely in the work. And these were 3 paintings dedicated to Cécile Fatima, Sanité Belair, and Toya Mantou. As I mentioned, Toya Mantou was Jean-Jacques Dessalines' aunt, believed to have taught him how to fight. Sanité Belair was a soldier in Toussaint Louverture's army and was eventually killed by Napoleon's army for her defiance. She's actually if you've ever seen a 20 goud, in which we call it in Haiti, it's like Haiti's version of the $20 bill. It's far less in value though. She's the woman on the currency. And then Cécile Fatima, who's the mambo, who was essential in beginning the revolution. Oftentimes, history books would talk about Dati Bougman, who was a priest who presided over the initial prayer that initiated the revolution, but it was actually Cécile who ran into town and started setting the homes of the French on fire. And so these 3 women I felt like needed their own sort of meditative moment in the exhibition. They really sort of served as anchors and indexes for how I thought about myth in the exhibition, how I thought about gender in the exhibition, and how we sort of remap onto the body fears, desires, expectations, and the ways in which that sort of system, very specific system of remapping, could produce new bodies, and could that be a potential to rethink what the body can do in space or what the body should do in space. For me, it really pointed to things to come, the next show or future shows, which I think will go even deeper into this method of sort of merging history, biography, and mythology. And thank you all.